All right. Before we get started, just a couple logistical things. We are muting you all just to kind of cut down on some of the noise. And this is being recorded. So if you don't want your lovely face on the recording that will go up on YouTube at some point, then feel free to turn your camera off. What else? Yeah, we have the chat open for questions, but I believe if the settings are correct, just we will be able to see the questions and we'll read them off. And that's just for the purposes so that there's not a ton of chatter going on and then you're distracted from us because, you know, we've all been in trainings where we're all looking at the chatter, at the chat instead of the presentation. So I think that's it. We are going to go ahead and get started and let Angie take it away and tell us what we're doing here.
Yes. So really how all of this was created is, and we thought that we would do this together is way back when, about 4 years ago or so, ICBT wasn't newer to the world, but it was a little newer to the US. And at that point, a few of us, a couple handfuls, got together on Fridays and created ICBT Fridays. And we were really collaborating and on this journey together on trying to understand ICBT and started to create visuals and documents and presentations and all these other things, just to help each other out. And what that created was a grassroots kind of movement for ICBT. And that's the ICBT community that you have the privilege of being with on our Fridays and other times as well. So we've really always been about collaboration and serving one another. And so and really just being able to show up for each other. And so when we noticed that there were some questions and things that might not have been interpreted correctly or some concerns, maybe things have been misconstrued or misconceptions, we thought, you know what, we're going to create this space where we can just kind of go through some of these things and answer some of these things together as a team, like we always have been. And so we created or collaborated with some of the beautiful and wonderful people that we're going to have on today. And so we're going to try to go through some of those questions and misconceptions, some of the myths that maybe sometimes we hear, because as we're talking about ICBT with our clients and helping them understand it, we want to have a good common ground and a good understanding of ICBT so that we can provide this understanding to our clients as we're talking about ERP, we're talking about ICBT, different modalities to use. So they have a good understanding, and we have a really good understanding of the modality that we're using. So today, or this evening, I guess, we're going to talk through some of those questions that we have.
All right, so we have some questions that we received prior to this little webinar, and we also want to take some live questions, so feel free to put them in the chat, or maybe we'll just even have you raise your hand. But so I'm going to start with a question we've received prior. We get this a lot, whether in the Facebook groups, at conferences. This is always a comment in after our presentations is, but where's the research? Is there actually enough research to utilize ICBT? Does all the research come from just one laboratory? And so this comes up a lot. So we would love to ask that first. Mike, would you like to take that?
Yeah, happy to. We get the boring stuff out of the way early. So I don't know what kind of detail people want, so I'll just sort of give a smattering of details. Let's start broad. So ICBT is an evidence-based treatment for OCD, full stop. So anything that's contradicting that is not accurate. It is an evidence-based treatment for OCD. What does that mean? That's something different. There's some qualifications you have to meet to get that. Specifically, you need a handful of really well-designed controlled trials, randomized controlled trials in particular. And you need to have at least one or more of those come from an independent lab, a lab that isn't from the developer of the treatment model. So ICBT meets this bar and then some, right? It's got right now 5 published controlled trials. Of those 5, 4 are randomized controlled trials. And 2 of them are from a completely independent lab. There is a 5th randomized controlled trial coming out within the next several months. And that is coming out of Fred's lab. So once that's published, that'll be approximately 300 people who have OCD that have been through I-CBT and shown really positive results. In controlled trials, they refer to those sort of effect sizes. And the effect sizes of the controlled trials that we have for I-CBT, which are all in comparison to ERP, not in comparison to progressive muscle relaxation, for example, they're not statistically different in outcomes. So the effect sizes are the same, roughly the same. So that is the treatment protocol. I-CBT is a package that's intended to treat OCD. What we have left to do is a meta-analysis, and that's the bar that you set when you're trying to establish yourself as an empirically supported treatment, which is just a phrase developed by certain governing bodies like the American Psychological Association and some other ones that says that your controlled trials have been averaged together and that we have a pretty precise idea of how effective your treatment is. And that's in the works. So that's a treatment package. A little bit about what's I would think a little more important than just the I-CBT treatment package is actually the underlying theory and the mechanisms that the package that we call I-CBT was meant to treat, which is inferential confusion and feared possible self. Those are the 2, interacting mechanisms that underline the theory of I-CBT. And there's a ton of data to support this. If I'm just taking a stab at how many, I'd say somewhere over 85 peer-reviewed studies across different methodologies for those people who are interested in what that means: experimental, cross-sectional, psychometric, longitudinal studies. About 1/3 of those studies come from labs independent of the developer's lab. So that's a lot. There's a lot more to do because research never ends, and we always want to get more clarity and grow. So that's the overview of whether I-CBT has research. Yes, it has a good amount of research. Does it have every single piece of research possible? No. What are we looking for next? Feasibly, we're looking for a meta-analysis so that it can be evaluated by whatever groups do such evaluations to label it empirically supported treatment. And that's just sort of taking the published clinical trials and basically performing a weighted average. So I will hit pause there, and maybe if there are more detailed questions about how the studies were conducted, if anyone even cares about that, you can throw that into the chat, and I'm happy to answer those questions as we progress. But yes, there is a decent amount of evidence for I-CBT, certainly enough to call it evidence-based. And I think a good reason to think that it's a solid treatment choice, a treatment option for people with OCD.
Mike, one of the questions that we notice sometimes come up about the research is, well, all of it was done in one lab. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. As I mentioned before, like the treatment trials themselves, of the 5 that are published, 3 are from the developer's lab, 2 are from independent labs. We would like more. Obviously, more is better. But, with a well-designed study, following the guidelines that you have, transparency, making sure you have independent raters, making sure Fred's not supervising all of the therapists delivering I-CBT of independent supervisors, you can largely cut out what they call researcher allegiance, which is the criticism that comes from all the treatment coming from one lab, or all the trials coming from one lab. It's the bias called researcher allegiance. And there's plenty of research to say that a well-designed trial really limits that effect. But we do have independent labs doing this as well. Close to 200 participants have been evaluated at an independent lab in the Netherlands. So, and they're replicating the same thing Fred is getting. And as I mentioned, in regards to the theory, the inferential confusion, feared possible self, I can't give you a specific number, but roughly a third of the total published data on that, which represents over 30 peer-reviewed studies, come from independent labs. Spain, Turkey, Iran, Germany, UK, and the US. John Abramowitz's lab has published 3 studies on inferential confusion and feared possible self. So it's growing.
Hey, so thanks, Mike. That was really helpful, especially for those of us who our brains don't work that way. You're always super helpful. One of the other questions that we often see is, isn't ICBT just repackaged ERP? We're talking about, just reality sensing as an exposure, and the bridge is response prevention. Who would like to speak to that a little bit?
I'll grab that one. Yeah, so the goals of ICBT and ERP are fundamentally different. And the goal with ERP is to learn to accept and tolerate discomfort. We hear a lot about acceptance of uncertainty. That's one purpose of it. With ICBT, it's to learn to trust yourself and to be able to stay grounded in reality. So these two things are fundamentally different. When it comes to reality sensing, if you want to liken reality sensing to exposure, these two things, the purpose is quite different, right? When you do an ERP exposure, you are activating anxiety, right? You're going into your imagination, you're bringing up all the stuff. With reality sensing, which is ICBT, the goal is to go into a situation that you have previously been avoiding and stay grounded in reality, right? Stay connected to your senses and not go off into your imagination. Similarly, both ERP and ICBT do stories or scripts, but again, these are fundamentally different. If you do an ERP script, you are going into your imagination, you are imagining the house burning down, you are imagining killing your family members, you are imagining, all of these things. You're going to the worst possible place in your imagination. On the other hand, with ICBT, writing a story, the purpose is to stay grounded in reality. So you don't go into your imagination, because in ICBT, we say, hey, the whole problem is that people spend too much time in their imaginations, that they're deferring to their imaginations at the expense of reality, at the expense of what the evidence is saying. And so in ICBT alternative story, the point is to tell a story that is as grounded and in reality as possible. So there may be kind of superficial similarities, but the purposes are quite different, and the way that they're conducted are quite different.
Sometimes, we sometimes hear too that the feared possible self is like just another word for the core fear. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So the core fear in ERP is basically the thing that you're afraid that could happen, right? With ICBT, the fear itself it's different. It's the fear of who you could be, right? And so there's it's the version of yourself that doesn't exist, but that you are afraid could exist if you don't take certain precautions. So you can kind of think of the core fear as an outcome or an event, whereas the fear itself is who you are afraid you could be.
Right. And we often say it's an inferentially confused self, and it's another doubt, just like any other obsessional doubts that we're working with. So it does have a specific difference, especially to OCD.
Yeah, it's also a story, right? The fear itself is a story that's based in the imagination.
I was going to see if anybody else on the panel has anything to add just about this idea that a lot of people think that there's several similarities between ERP and ICBT. Any other differentiations? Otherwise, Kate, got it. Okay. I'm going to see, since there's no questions in the chat quite yet, if anybody wanted to ask one live, you can raise your hand or unmute. I'm just looking. And while you guys are... Thank you.
Just add that the group chat is disabled, so someone would have to send a message to one of you individually.
Yes, we did
Okay.
that. Yes.
Yeah.
So that
But then, because you both, Angie and Fran, have said, like, I want to remind you, this is a safe place, ask your questions, but we can't. I mean, we could if we email you individually, but some people might just not realize that, I'm wondering.
Oh, yes. Submit your questions so that we can see them. Yes, it'll come straight to us. Absolutely. Thank you. All right. Nobody has any questions? Whether you want to... Oh, Kelly Fallon, you raised your hand. Go ahead and unmute if you'd like.
Okay. Oh, my question was about expectations for feeling anxiety or like other distress in the process of ICBT. So I've had some like conversations with different therapists, and I think there's been some, I guess, like difference of opinion in terms of like what's the realistic expectation for distress decreasing in the process of ICBT. So like some people feel like it's an unrealistic expectation that some people put out there about ICBT, like that your distress is going to like instantly disappear as soon as you're able to like see things clearly. And so that's like not necessarily my understanding of from ICBT. It's more of like a transition, like you make a shift over time based on like immersing yourself in this, new way of thinking. But apparently there's, kind of different opinions about that or different information about that that's being like, that's going around the internet, I'll say. So I wanted someone to kind of clarify like what officially is ICBT saying about those expectations.
I think there's so many of us. We're not sure which one to ask. Kelly, thanks for asking the question, by the way. Because again, like we put in the chat, we really do like this is a space to ask the hard questions or the things that maybe you've heard and we're afraid to ask. I've often been there, so please ask. So thank you. One of the things that I guess that I would say about that is that part of understanding OCD through an ICBT framework is understanding how all of this has been created, and it's created through that certain type of logic and reasoning. And as we gain understanding into how this is being created, we also know how to deconstruct OCD as well. And typically the feelings are associated with the consequences of the obsessional doubt. And so as you learn how it is constructed, you also learn about how are those feelings connected to the whole obsessional sequence. And as that begins to become apparent, there is less fear because the consequence doesn't really exist if the obsessional doubt isn't true to begin with, or it can be resolved. And I'll let others give their thought on that too.
I'll say too that, we'll often hear from our clients like, yeah, I know, but I'm still afraid, right? I'm still anxious. And anytime a client says that, that's an indicator to me that they're still under the spell, that something is still hooking them, right? Like you can watch a scary movie and your heart's racing and you feel scared. And then when it's over, if you're still scared, it's because part of you is still there, right? And so if you kind of say, well, intellectually, I know all of these things, but I'm still feeling anxious. To me, that's a sign that, okay, I need to dig in and see what's still hooking you. Where are you still inferentially confused? Where are you still bought in? So yeah.
Yeah. So the clinical choice point when anxiety shows up in a session, if you're working from a behavioral model, then what you want to do is that you want to lean into the anxiety, tolerate the anxiety, refrain from engaging in the compulsion, right? And it's basically based on a phobic model, a behavioral model of OCD, which is not wrong. It can be very, very effective. But the clinical choice point when anxiety shows up when you're doing I-CBT is that that's a flag rather than to go downstream to prevent the compulsions and tolerate the anxiety. It's to go upstream. And as Kate said, let's check out and explore how you are generating this anxiety through a story. Now, we still, we talk about the OCD bubble, right? And getting absorbed in the obsessional story. It's actually a form of dissociation. It's called imaginal absorption, right? And all of us get hooked in scary stories. But what happens over time is that you're able to catch yourself soon, actually at least recognize that you're lost in the bubble and come out by doing a reality sensing, grounding yourself in what's real. And then you get more and more adept at knowing when you're about to go into the bubble. So it is an evolution over time. It is a skill. It is awareness. Now there are some people for when they recognize that it's all made up, that it's all just a scary story, there can be a quantum leap of, where there's just a significant reduction in the Y box, and that they hardly, have very little anxiety in response to former triggers, et cetera. I mean, that can happen, but normally it's a process. It's a 12 module process that takes time.
Kelly, did that make sense? Does that help you understand the question, or are there still?
Yeah, I think Carl's answer made some sense and kind of confirmed like it's it is more of a transition. Because I think that's how I've been viewing it, but I think sometimes like the messaging is like, okay, as soon as you're able to, kind of deconstruct, like we're saying, then, those emotions that are associated are going to fade away. And I guess it's like, well, it's just not completely realistic that they're just going to like, poof, disappear. Like that's great if that happens sometimes. But yeah, I think like for a lot of people, the expectation probably is that like it is going to be this like transition that's happening.
So we are getting a few questions in the chat now. So I'll go ahead and read one of those off if that's okay. We got asked, could we touch on the difference between what an exposure in ERP would look like versus an I-CBT of what an example would look like there with a real client? And so obviously, since we don't do exposures with I-CBT, maybe what an example would look like with reality sensing or just staying in the here and now, trusting your senses. And I can even give a stab at it because in my recent consultation group, somebody said, when I was describing staying in the here and now, they're like, that sounds like an exposure. And we talked about it looks like the exact same thing, but it depends on what the intention is, why we're doing it. So I'll just give the example of, let's say they doubt that their food is contaminated. We go through the ICBT process and we are trusting that our food is fine because it looks fine and it tastes fine and our common sense knows it's not expired. And so we're staying in the here and now and trusting our reality. There we go. That's ICBT. Well, and they said, well, isn't that an exposure, eating the food? So at the end of the day, it might look to the average person like we're doing the exact same thing. We're eating the food, right, Amanda? But with an exposure, I'm asking them to eat the food to produce anxiety in order to habituate to it. In ICBT, we're eating the food without that intention, without the anxiety. We know that it's fine because it looks fine, it tastes fine, it smells fine, hasn't expired. So the action might look the exact same, but the reason we're doing it is completely different. Anybody want to add on? Maybe you have a better example?
I have an example like with driving. So let's say an ICBT therapist and ERP therapist are having a client drive. So at the end of that trip, the ERP therapist would say, you have to accept that you can't be sure if you hit someone or not, right? That's just something that you need to tolerate the uncertainty about, tolerate the discomfort about. An ICBT therapist would be like, did you see anybody? Did anyone land on your windshield? Like, what's your evidence that it was anything other than fine, right? And so the goal with ERP, again, is to tolerate that discomfort and that uncertainty. With ICBT, it's to say, you have no evidence that anything is wrong, right? Everything's fine. You didn't see anyone, you didn't hear anyone. Anything that is leading you to believe that you hit someone is based in the imagination. And so it's to stay grounded in reality.
I can throw out another example, Amanda. So yeah, if you're having an obsession, it might be something like, can my thoughts affect things? You know, if I have a certain thought, might that make something happen in reality? That's what we might call like a magical thinking obsession. With ERP, we would just go all in on that. We would say, okay, let's imagine your thoughts can make things happen. Let's write stories about having thoughts and then something bad happens. Let's go into whatever makes you anxious and let's get through that experience by immersing yourself in it, feeling the anxiety, feeling the fear, and then getting through it. And then let's repeat that and let's do that every week. And then maybe let's even like do that every day. And then the idea would be this would sort of burn away this, phobia you have, I guess you could say. And, as Carl said, that really helps, and for a lot of people, that's the answer. With ICBT, we're going to do something different, though. We're going to say, how did you get immersed in this abstract possibility in the first place? How did you get immersed in a story that your thoughts have power? And let's see exactly what that story is. Usually it's like my thoughts have power. Other people's don't, but mine do somehow. And let's have you write out that story. Let's hear how this logic unfolds. And now let's do something different because this story unfolded possibly at an earlier age, for one thing, when you were a kid and your thinking was different. And the story probably unfolded when you weren't accessing your own common sense. So let's do that. Let's do an exercise where you tell me exactly what you think about can thoughts affect things? Can your thoughts affect things? And we're not going to be in possibility anymore. I want you to really use your common sense and I want you to tell me what you actually really think about this. And that's going to be a very different step for that person. They've been very immersed and absorbed in this abstract possibility. They haven't trusted themselves. They haven't trusted themselves to come up with an opinion. And so we might do that. We might do some exercises of accessing the common sense. And then we might then do an exposure. We might do a prompt where it's like, okay, let's have that thought you're scared to have. But we're not going to sit here and just get immersed in this thought's going to make something happen. Let's have you have the thought. And I want you to stay grounded in what is happening in reality. Is anything in the world around you telling you right now your thoughts, these electrical signals in your brain, these words popping in your head, are going to have some sort of impact on reality. I want you to stay just in the world of your senses and just in the place where you trust yourself, and tell me if you see anything that tells you to worry about that. And that's the step of staying in that world of reality, staying in the world of the senses, staying in the world of what we know. It's a really hard step for a lot of people. It does cause anxiety, but we're providing a lot of support, and we're like giving them the tools to access these faculties that they have to be this self-sufficient person again. So hope that's another example of what that question was about.
Thanks, Mike. We'll go through another question that we often have, and it's I-CBT is really just reassurance seeking, and that's really fundamentally compulsive.
I can take that one. And I can see why this question gets asked, because I think for people who are brand new to ICBT or haven't learned ICBT yet, we are going into the content, right? We're looking at that to find a logic and reasoning. We're finding that narrative. We're using alternative narratives. We're using reality sensing. So that can look on the surface like it could be we're providing reassurance, or we are teaching them something that could become compulsive. But it's the intention behind those things that matters, behind those actions, those skills that we're trying to teach. Because any tool, when you are sitting with somebody with OCD, I'm sure that there are people in this group tonight that have lived experience of OCD. And for any of you who have been treating OCD for a while, you know that any modality or any skill can become a source of reassurance or become a compulsion for an OCD sufferer. Those of us living with reassurance or with lived experience can get really, really good at turning your silence into reassurance for us. If we know if we ask you a question and you don't, to get reassurance and you don't answer, then we know by default you don't think that we're actually at risk of whatever that thing is that happened, because you care about us. You're not going to let us put ourselves in danger. So anything can become that way. But as we're teaching these skills in ICBT, if they're becoming compulsive, it's probably because either the clinician just has some more learning to do with how to apply that skill in therapy, and it's just coming out in a way that needs to be taught a little differently, or the client themselves needs to understand really what we're trying to do with that skill. So every aspect of ICBT is supposed to be tied back to the process that that person is using to create that obsessional doubt. And that's what helps us keep things from becoming reassurance seeking, or reassurance that we're giving for OCD content, or that the skill that we're teaching is going to become compulsive, because we need them to see that the trick that's being done, that's pulling them in, that's what we're trying to get them to focus on. So are they staying with what their senses are saying to them, which is usually that everything is fine, or are they leaving that information behind and instead getting caught up in all of that content that they have stored in their mind, which is being hijacked by that process, and then that pulls them in to that very deep and real feeling narrative. So everything we do in ICBT is showing that trick at play. So to me, ICBT is the ultimate response prevention, because when you see that trick that OCD is using to convince you to listen, when you understand that process, and again, it's all about that process, you no longer believe the trick. And therefore, you don't need to do anything that is compulsive anymore. And you're hopefully being taught in a way, the skills of ICBT in a way that aren't going to become compulsive for you. And as somebody with 3 decades of lived experience of OCD, I can tell you that there is a very big difference between seeking reassurance for your OCD content versus gaining insight so that you understand what your brain is doing to trick you to believe that thought to begin with. Because there isn't any reassurance of OCD content involved in ICBT. There's just freedom from it.
Bronwyn, question for you a little bit more. Sometimes, ICBT is inference-based cognitive behavior therapy. So CBT is in that phrase. Sometimes we hear the cognitive treatments don't work, like the talk therapy doesn't work. So talk about that a little bit, if you would.
Well, there's a very big difference between talk therapy and ICBT, because in ICBT, we are, like I said, we're uncovering that whole process. There's something so different about sitting down and learning exactly what your mind is doing in that moment when you are sliding into OCD territory. Understanding that trick, just understanding what your mind is doing, it's actually really simple. I mean, all of us with OCD that are here that have learned about inferential confusion, once you see it in yourself, it's very simple what's happening. But it's not talk there because we're not going in, we're not, trying to just sit and with the content and dispute it even. We're not doing any of that. We're really looking at that process that's involved and helping that person understand, look, this is what your mind's doing in these very specific contexts. You don't do that over here at all. You just do it right here. And once you see that trick, you can't unsee it. It's just really phenomenally big time, lots of change.
Thanks, Bronwyn.
Carl, you had your hand up.
Yeah. Let me, that was excellent, Bronwyn. Thank you. I just want to add that and really emphasize that anything can be used compulsively. Many of us have seen exposure used compulsively. That if I don't continue to do 8 hours of exposure a day, that I'm going to relapse. That's compulsive, right? So any intervention that we use can be misused. Let me just do a quick thought experiment here. All right. Now, notice where you are, and I'm going to bring up a what if. What if your house is on fire? Okay. What do you notice? What do you notice when that thought comes up? Do you smell any smoke? Do you see any flames? Right? Do you hear any crackling of fire or whatever? Right? Okay. Now, is that reassuring that your house isn't on fire? Okay. Yeah, I guess that's reassuring. Reality happens to be reassuring most of the time, right? Right? So the fact that the fact that a process yields relief or comfort doesn't make it compulsive. Right? Reassurance is only compulsive when it's done as a compulsion. Right? But notice how effortlessly we use our senses in that context to know that there's no problem right now in the presence of that possibility. Right? So hopefully that gives you, a flavor of what we're talking about here.
I love that. Reality is reassuring, but it doesn't mean it's compulsive. So thank you for that. I have a question from the chat. As many of us know here, if you have been trained in ICBT, when we're exploring ICBT's logic, we will look for, what makes that doubt feel so compelling. And this can include things from the past, like, well, it has happened before, right? And somebody asked, well, how do you help a client use this to form a new view or construct a new obsession or a new inference when it has happened before? So can anybody talk about what we do with personal experiences, past experiences, and through an ICBT lens?
So I'm happy to continue.
You have experience with this?
A lot of experience with this, and a lot of you know that I also work with PTSD. So when you've got clients with co-occurring PTSD and OCD, this can get particularly sticky. But think about all the past things that have happened to you in your life. There's a ton of them, right? And people with OCD aren't using all of those equally. So there could be many other past events, and they would say, yes, just because something happened there, that doesn't mean it's happening now. They can see that. It's only in situations where they're getting pulled away from their senses by inferential confusion that they are then using that logic that past events equal something happening now. And clients will tell you, yes, but I care about this and I didn't care about that. That doesn't matter either. Again, we're coming back to the process that they're using, their relationship with possibility, their relationship with those past events. They don't use them to make an inference in every other aspect of their life, except in areas where OCD is coming up, unless sense data tells you to use that information in this moment to support a potential possibility that's actually happening.
Right. Just that quick phrase of possibility doesn't equal relevance, right? We have another question, and this is kind of a question that we've had a lot, but it's using a little bit of older language. So I think we can probably clear this up. Can you explain, Linda asked, can you explain the difference between vulnerable self-theme and feared possible self? And I can try to answer that real quick and then hear other people. So when we first kind of started meeting, we were calling the feared possible self the vulnerable self theme. And the language has kind of changed over time, that everyone has a vulnerable self, everyone has vulnerabilities, but the feared possible self is specific to OCD. And as we were talking earlier, it's an inferentially confused self. So it's another obsessional doubt too. And Carl and Kate, you guys talk about the ought self too, and that might be interesting to hear you talk to that a little bit.
Carl, you want to go first?
You go. You go first.
So if you think about, we all have different self concepts, right? We have an ideal self, which is sort of the best version of ourselves, who we aspire to be. And we have an ought self, which is kind of who we feel responsible to be, who we feel that we should be, right? And both the ideal self and the ought self push us towards something, right? They draw us to a particular way of being or existing in the world. The feared self is, or you can think of the vulnerable self as kind of like the worst version of ourselves. The feared self is in a totally different category because it's made up, right? It is based on a story. So when we think of the ideal self and the ought self, this is kind of various versions of ourselves that we're aspiring to be. Whereas the feared self is this kind of elusive, enigmatic thing that we are always running from. And because we're always running from it, it just sort of seems it's perpetual, it's endless. Anything to add, Carl?
Very good.
Right. I'm going to ask a question that we have received before this webinar, and it kind of matches a question we received from Amy in the chat as well. So a common misconception is that ICBT is basically just we're challenging our thoughts, we're disputing cognitive distortions. And Amy asked a similar question about is the alternative, someone can say that the alternative story is just disputing content of the obsessional story. So would anybody like to speak to this idea?
Can I, Amanda? Is that all right?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Yeah, so I love this question because I've dealt with this confusion myself before too. I'm a classically CBT, Beckian CBT trained clinician, a diplomat in the Academy of Cognitive Therapy, and everything that I've been trained to do is like, hey, let's look at the evidence for and against this thought you have, right? And let's dispute it. Let's find the real sort of most likely outcome here and look at those distortions that led you there. And somehow if we keep investigating this, that we'll go ahead and find an answer, right? So if you're looking at the person who's driving down the road and they hit a bump and they have this thought, gee, I wonder if that was a person, that, the classic CBT approach here, and part of the problem, by the way, is the nomenclature. Because we have CBT, I-CBT, CBTI, it all gets kind of confusing. But the classic CBT approach is going to say, oh, well, what's the evidence for and against the idea that you could have hit a person, right? And then that person with OCD is going to say, well, I guess I didn't see a body. All right. Can we move on? But you know what happens, right? The person who's suffering from OCD says, well, what if they crawled under a bush and I can't see them anymore? right? And then we say, well, do you hear any sirens, right? And they say, yeah, well, that could come later, or maybe I missed it, or I was so neglectful that I missed the fact that I ran over someone, that I also missed the sirens. So people's doubt can outrun their ability to rationalize the worries that they have. As much as we try to rationalize it and come up with something that's more fair and balanced, the doubts of OCD can, overpower them. So a key difference here, and I really had to learn this, is that we're not trying to argue with the content of what the OCD is saying at all. Because the second we get into an argument, we're going to lose, and we just wind up suffering more and more and more, finding something that feels reassuring and then doubting it later, starting the whole cycle again. So, major difference that we have to hold on to, especially if you're coming from a background where you're trained in CBT, is that you're not looking to dispute these things as distortions. You're not putting the thoughts on trial. You're not trying to come to some ultimate truth about them. Once again, you want to, in I-CBT, go back to figuring out the process. How did all this get started? It started with a trigger. Then there is an obsessional doubt. What's an obsessional doubt? It's a doubt about something with no evidence in the here and now. And that's what gets me really excited about this approach, is that you're really kind of using reality, right, as the thing that you're kind of measuring things against. And once you're grounded in reality, it gets a lot easier to see the inferential confusion and the way that OCD kind of constructs these stories about remote possibilities. So the worst thing that we could do, probably, maybe not the worst, but one of the things that we could do that is definitely not going to help, is trying to argue with the content of people's OCD doubts and worries. Instead, the cognitive part, the I-CBT part, is really a learning experience where people learn to see how the OCD operates, and they learn to understand what inferential confusion is, and they learn the difference of how it feels when they're present to what's happening in reality, and how they can trust themselves, and how they feel safe and at ease, versus how they feel when they're inferentially confused, imaginally absorbed, and in the bubble of the OCD. So it's cognitive because we're learning something, but not because we're disputing the content. I hope that makes sense.
That was great, Fran. Thanks. Michelle, let's take a question live. I saw Michelle there a second ago. Maybe she just
Hi, are you able to hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I feel like this question's like illegal, so don't even use my name. I was wondering, when it comes to the modules and the format of how you deliver the intervention, if you stay to fidelity with like module by module as it is, or stay with, the book like concept to concept, or if sometimes I've noticed sometimes with clients, it just makes more sense to do a minor bit of movement, just due to their presentation or the way their brain works. And I was wondering, how do you gauge when it's like, yes, that concept is totally integrated? Sometimes it feels like they get it logically, but there's still that skepticism of, does this apply to me? And I was just wondering, how do you determine, like, when do you move on, and kind of the order there?
Good question. I think most of us here are pretty flexible, kind of with the movement and going with the clients, figuring out when we need to address what. But by all means, if anybody's super rigid with the modules, speak up.
I will say, I think when we first started understanding I-CBT more, we were kind of module 1, 2, 3, 4. And then as we all started to gain understanding, we became a lot more flexible in that. And I think you can see that in resolving 1 and 2 as well, that it's changed a little bit.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit, like the question of keeping fidelity. It's not fidelity to the order of the modules as they're currently laid out, because the order of the modules have changed over the years. From the first RCT, which started recruiting in 1998, where they didn't even have the treatment manual, to what they did, in the trials since then based on the 2012 manual, and what's going to be coming later, which is going to be based on resolving OCD's orientation of the modules. So the fidelity is to the processes that you're going after, right? You're going after the resolution of inferential confusion, the correction of the feared possible self, and to do so in ways that are known to work, that are evidence-based through what we know about I-CBT. So that's the fidelity is to treating inferential confusion and feared possible self, not necessarily to doing module 3 after module 2. That being said, I do think that there's a standard idea of psychoed in any CBT approach to OCD or any CBT approach to anything, right? Like we start with psychoed, and the first 4 modules of the current, well, at least I should say of the 2012 treatment manual, the first 4 modules are all psychoeducation. And so I think it's fair to say those 4 should come before the rest of the processing that shows up. We don't want to start with reality sensing and then do the sequencing at the very end of treatment. That wouldn't make any sense. But I think there is some flexibility once we get past psychoeducation.
Beautiful. And Michelle, I thought it was going to be a much spicier question than that.
Well, I feel like historically when it's been asked, maybe this is a couple of years ago, it was more rigid response when they were using like the pencil white book.
Yeah.
And so I'm glad that like shifted a little bit and is allowed from the experts.
Thank you for your question. Here's why we have received a lot, and I can't wait to see who answers it. Let's talk about certainty and how the differences between certainty and uncertainty, and then functional certainty, and how I-CBT basically is just repackaging this idea of tolerating uncertainty. So can we speak to this?
Amanda, I'm happy to take this one.
I'll go next.
Oh, thanks, Carl. I'd rather go before you. I'm sure you. Yes. This is such an important question because it's the question that won't go away. Is I-CBT just another way of saying tolerate uncertainty? That's interesting because I-CBT is actually quite critical of the idea of uncertainty being the issue with OCD. But actually, I understand why someone would think someone with OCD is struggling with intolerance of uncertainty. Because if you look at someone washing their hands repeatedly, asking lots of reassurance, it does look like they're trying to seek some sort of absolute certainty. It looks like they can't handle this possibility even being possible, and they're just doing everything they can to wipe it out. But this kind of breaks down if you look at it more closely for a couple reasons. Like, number one, that individual doing that compulsion in all other areas of their life is surrounded by infinite possibilities, all sorts of possibilities. They get, if their obsession is something in the kitchen, they're getting into cars, no problem. They're getting in planes, no problem. They're dealing with situations where there's uncertain outcomes all the time and not even thinking twice about it. And so the idea that they universally can't tolerate uncertainty doesn't really hold up. And then the other thing is, and Carl, I'm going to steal this from you. You've mentioned this numerous times, that we enjoy uncertainty in certain situations. We like watching sporting events. We like TV shows where you don't know what's going to happen next. It's enjoyable. And this is not something that is different with people with OCD. So this idea of someone with OCD can't handle uncertainty, it doesn't totally hold up. So from an I-CBT perspective, we're going to say it's not actually about uncertainty. And let's start with what I-CBT says is healthy functioning. I-CBT is going to say that we don't actually tolerate possibilities. We're surrounded by them. We don't walk around tolerating them and accepting them. We actually keep them in this place of irrelevance. We keep them off the map. We keep them in the abstract. Like, that's nothing I even need to address or think about. And the way we do this from an I-CBT perspective is we have these barriers. We have these barriers that keep these possibilities out. Those barriers are, when we start talking about your five senses, we start talking about what you know about yourself. We all know lots of things about ourselves if we trust ourselves to do that. And we all have common sense, and everybody with OCD has common sense, but that can also be distrusted. And once one of these barriers is distrusted, a possibility can sneak in. There's a breakdown. A client argues themselves into not trusting a sense. They say that, it's insufficient in some way, or what I know about myself is wrong in some way, or my common sense, I shouldn't listen to that for some reason. And then that's when the world of possibility can come in. And ICBT also has a why someone gets stuck on a certain possibility. ICBT is going to say that, we're going to look at someone's feared possible self. We're going to look at what they really think is flawed about themselves, where they think they're vulnerable in life. And then we're going to look at a very personal story they've constructed that led them to a very specific possibility that has really just taken up all that real estate in their mind. So we're really looking at each person's personal journey that led them to this specific possibility. And so, with ICBT, we're just saying clients allowed an abstract possibility to invade their reality, and this is unhealthy. We don't want to tolerate that. We don't want to accept this abstract possibility. Nobody's doing that. And we want to help them get back to knowing things. So that's my take. I hope that helps a little bit clear that up, because I know that's a lot, that confusion comes up a lot for people.
Carl.
Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna have start with a contest. All right. I'm gonna Venmo $100 to anyone who can tell me who Anne Elizabeth Fowler Hodges is. Can you check the chat for me and go ahead and send me a message and I'll Venmo you $100 as soon as this. Okay. All right. Nobody got that one. All right. Anne Elizabeth Fowler Hodges was a woman in Texas who was taking a nap, and a meteor fell through her house and hit her, and she ended up in the hospital with an injured hip. Right? So we can create an obsession from that and say, well, it's possible that leaving the house today, we could get hit on the head with a meteor. Right? And we could get absorbed into that story using that, an obsessional story, using that out of context possibility to convince ourselves that this is something that we need to be vigilant about. Right? Now, if I go out of the house and I'm looking up in the sky, checking for meteors tonight, all right, or rather, I'm not checking for meteors. Am I tolerating the uncertainty? Am I saying to myself, oh, maybe there's a meteor coming, maybe there's not, I'm going to take that risk? Is that really how we function in life with possibility? Even though we know that it somehow is possible? No. All right. And no, we have functional certainty, and that's not compulsive reassurance, right? That's living our lives knowing that is irrelevant. It has nothing to do with right here, right now. And there may be a question now, how might that be relevant? Well, if I live somewhere that tends to have a lot of meteor showers, and I know that tonight I hear from the weather service that there's going to be a meteor shower. Yeah, and then it becomes relevant. And then maybe I do need to take a risk and tolerate that uncertainty. It then becomes relevant in that context. All right. So this, it is, possibility is not evidence. And then the question in ICBT is when somebody is absorbed in a possibility, rather than saying, oh, you need to tolerate it, the fundamental clinical choice point is how does that possibility become relevant, particularly when you don't do that in any other aspect of your life, other than in these particular vulnerable areas that are largely informed by the vulnerable self theme. Right.
Would it be okay if I added a little to this? I don't want to beat a dead horse. So, you know, a lot of ways of looking at OCD thus far have been talking about how people with OCD demand perfect certainty, demand absolute certainty, and that because those things don't exist in reality, that person must then therefore accept or tolerate the uncertainty that they're experiencing. And the only real uncertainty that any of us truly have to tolerate is that which is not known about the future. And even then, the word tolerate takes on a very different meaning. As Mike and Carl were talking about, we only tolerate that which is relevant, right? So if I went to my doctor and they felt a lump on my neck and said, well, we should take a biopsy, and then it may or may not be cancerous, the future will tell me. I am uncertain about the future. That's relevant to my health. That might be concerning. So I do have to tolerate that kind of uncertainty. But that's not OCD, right? Because OCD isn't about what is there. It's about what isn't there, but might be. And this is where we start getting a different kind of conceptualization. So in the ICBT conceptualization, uncertainty is not a relevant target for treatment because it's downstream of something earlier, which is doubting. So ICBT is dealing with doubting, not dealing with uncertainty. The doubting is what creates distress. Amongst the distresses you could have is uncertainty. So I'll close with this. When we think about doubting, we think about information that you had and then don't trust anymore or call into question. That's what doubting means. Absolute certainty is not ever what was doubted. People never had absolute certainty to begin with. No one did. It's a philosophically empty idea, right? So it's metaphor, right? And OCD operates here and now in our day to day. So absolute certainty isn't what was ever had and then doubted, but everyday knowledge, everyday trust, everyday certainty, functional certainty, practical certainty. They did have that. And then they doubted it. And moreover, they still have it everywhere else in their life. And they don't doubt it everywhere else in their life. They only doubt it here, selectively. So when we're starting to think about this practically, we're not asking people from an ICBT lens to tolerate the uncertainty of something that was caused by doubting that shouldn't have been. We're asking them to understand how the doubting arose and how that doubting doesn't apply anywhere else in their life. And then we want to help them resolve the doubting. So again, focusing on uncertainty doesn't make sense in ICBT.
So I'm going to one up that and ask a question too that I hear often, and that's about certainty and future events.
Yeah, I'll talk about that. In fact, that's often the example I tend to see thrown out there, like in some of our groups or on podcasts and things like that. But like, how can you be certain that, what if I could go to jail? What if I could get in a car accident? Or I know somebody asked in the chat after your example, Carl, about the house fire. They're like, well, I know there's no house fire right now, but what if there could be a house fire later? That's what we're more concerned about. And I think that's where it's important to understand how ICBT conceptualizes what an obsession is or what the obsessional doubt is. And so a lot of times it's just a misunderstanding. The obsessional doubt is what we are questioning in the here and now, in this moment. So like with Carl's example, are you questioning that you smell fire or smell smoke or see fire or that your candle is lit and there's some paper hanging over it? You're questioning something in the here and now. After the obsessional doubt come the consequences of the doubt. And this is what would happen if the doubt came true. And a lot of times when people are throwing out examples of like, but Amanda, what if I could go to jail? Those tend to be the examples of the consequences of the doubt. So what if I could go to jail, which tend to be more future oriented? There would need to be something that is true in the here and now for that to occur. So what might be an obsessional doubt for what if I could go to jail? Well, I murder somebody or I hit somebody with my car, stuff like that. Those would be the target or the focus of ICBT is what I'm questioning right now. Did I murder somebody? Did I hit somebody with my car? The consequence, the doubt, that future-oriented thought of, well, I'd go to jail, we're not tackling that. Not that that isn't scary to you or get stuck as well, but we're not tackling that because if we can resolve the obsessional doubt you're having in this moment, the rest, the byproduct, the result of that falls apart. So the consequences go away, the emotion goes away, the compulsions go away. So, anybody add anything to that?
Okay, we'll take a question from the chat, and it's one again. Obviously, that's what we're doing is asking the things that are confusing. But this is about using and combining ICBT and ERP. Can it be done together?
I'll take a little shot at this, although frankly, there are way more expert people here too. But I think one of the things I'd say is that a metaphor that's helped me understand the difference between the two is that exposure therapy occurs within the context of the bubble of the of the bubble of the OCD rather. So, again, you've got this trigger, you got this doubt. As Amanda just said, you're really kind of very concerned about the consequences of the doubt. You're up in your imagination. You're feeling all this distress and you want to do something about it, right? You got to do something. You have this urgency to try to rid yourself of those terrible feelings, get some certainty, convince yourself that it won't happen and that you're safe. And what ERP says is, okay, you got to set up that trigger, feel all those bad feelings, and then don't do anything with it, right? Like, don't try to convince yourself that you're safe. Don't try to find out if you're all right. Just, prevent your responsiveness to this. Don't engage in compulsion until you kind of get used to those bad feelings and realize you can habituate to them, or you have an expectancy violation, or you have inhibitory learning or some other process that goes on. So ERP occurs within the bubble of the OCD when you've already left your senses behind and have gotten pulled into this inferential confusion, pulled into imagination, pulled into the world of possibility, and essentially are told, hang in there until it starts to go away, if it does. And what ICBT says is actually we don't need to do any of that if we can resolve the doubt that led you to go into that bubble in the first place. So others can say a lot more about it, but fundamentally they're very different approaches. And when you look at the question of the word of exposure, I think we would do ourselves a favor by trying to define that a little bit. So exposure in ERP is the purpose of it is habituation or extinction learning or inhibitory learning or distress tolerance or tolerance of uncertainty. Exposure in I-CBT is living your life, right? Trusting your senses and moving through the world connected to the here and now. Kind of restoring a sense of trust in who you are and what you're capable of that you had before the OCD took over. I'll stop there. There's probably better explanations out there.
Question. So there were some comments or questions about how can we trust senses and our reality when everybody can have a different perspective? And we even got this question in the chat about like when, witnesses from an event can all have a different perspective. Carl, you were raising your hand. Tell me about this.
Yeah, this was, I did some preparation for this. Right? Yeah, that's often cited, right? Is that how can we really trust our senses when in fact, the research on witness testimony is often so variable between people, all right? Okay. you are talking about a completely different process, right? There's a whole sequence of processes involved in witness testimony, right? There's the perception, there's the attention, there's the encoding of the memory, there's the storage of the memory, there's the retrieval of the memory, and then there are the social aspects of reporting that memory. All right. So this isn't just, looking around to see whether or not your house is on fire, right? You're talking about, what ends up in witness testimony is the result of a long stream of mental processes that can go haywire. And when it goes haywire, it doesn't mean that you didn't see what you saw, right? The other thing is that what happens in people are witnessing traumatic events usually, right? And and they're in a high state of arousal. Their attention is focused, so people are literally seeing different things. All right, that's another factor here. All right, so that is not evidence. That is not evidence to doubt I-CBT. It's a really interesting thing. In a way, that question is an evidence of what happens in OCD, which is the idea of borrowing an out of context process or event or fact and recruiting it in to make your argument that in this particular case, I-CBT doesn't work because look, right? But in fact, it's not only relevant, it's not even the same thing, and you're bridging apples and oranges. Now, I'll tell you something else that I found out in my research of witness testimony, which is really interesting. When witnesses get together and they share their stories, like 70% of the time, their stories change and they start to include stuff that they actually didn't perceive. They actually add into the story what they didn't see, which is kind of a description of OCD. All right. So what does that tell us? That tells us the power of story, the social contagion of story, and how story can actually make us question our senses. Right? And that's what OCD does. That's what the witness research tells us that actually supports this idea about the processes that are involved in inferential confusion.
I will
Another
not
thing
that I
too.
no, go ahead, Kate.
Another thing too is that can the senses be wrong? Yes, they can. And they are the best we've got to connect to reality, right? They are the best we've got. They're all we've got. And so the solution of going into your imagination to connect to reality doesn't make any sense, right? It's staying with the senses. So just because the senses can be fallible, that doesn't make going into the imagination make any sense. It just takes you further away from the truth.
And this question's always interesting to me because it actually has nothing to do with I-CBT or OCD. Like Carl said, it's a completely different thing. And the assumption is that trusting your senses or perception somehow means that there's only one viewpoint on the world that we should all be striving for, and that our senses are untrustworthy. So this isn't at all what we mean by trusting the senses when we're talking about this in ICBT. And that isn't how any of us live our lives either. We're not all trying to see things from one viewpoint, all trying to get to this absolute truth. So, because we all experience the world in totally different ways. And so my job as a clinician is to help clients get back to not doubting their senses, not getting pulled away from them in those OCD triggering situations. Mike likes to talk about lack of doubt. I want them to return to lack of doubt in OCD triggering situations. So we're not seeking absolute truth. This isn't a philosophy problem at all. We want OCD sufferers to allow their senses to do their jobs. That's basically what we're trying to do with ICBT. So to not let the imagination override those senses. There's billions of people around this world right now that are walking through life just letting their senses tell them when a possibility is relevant to the context that that person is in. And people with OCD do that all the time too, except in situations where they're getting triggered by their OCD. And that is because of inferential confusion. So the question around what people see things differently, it's a totally unconnected question related to ICBT.
Can I add something to that? And then we'll take Kelly's question because you have your hand up, right, Kelly? So yeah, I think it's easy to hear that part of ICBT involves trusting your senses in areas where you currently doubt them. We don't doubt our senses everywhere. We just doubt them in OCD areas. And to hear that and say, oh, so ICBT is just about trusting your senses. No, ICBT is about resolving inferential confusion, not about trusting your senses. The result of resolving inferential confusion is that you go back to naturally, effortlessly trusting your senses. So it's important that we don't like cherry pick out a soundbite of what ICBT sounds like to someone and then argue against a soundbite, but to understand what it really is, right? ICBT is about resolving inferential confusion. The outcome of that is many things, including no longer doubting where you ought not be doubting. And part of that means that you effortlessly, I can't say that word, you naturally trust your senses. And so it's almost as if when we're learning ICBT, when we're trying to understand ICBT, and dare I say you debate ICBT, I would actually argue you should learn it before you debate it. That's just my idea. Would be that, senses is simply a small piece of what inferential confusion is. And so we can't go, oh, it's just this. So I think the larger community would benefit from slowing down and sort of looking at this and asking themselves, do I understand these concepts before I start cherry picking ideas and then arguing with these ideas out of context? When we learn ICBT, we learn about it talking about the obsessional story. We don't learn about it talking philosophically. And so we can't remove the concepts of inferential confusion from OCD or from an OCD story and then start debating individual ideas as if that represents the whole model.
Kelly, you had a question?
Sorry, my dog's barking right now. So I was kind of bridging off of what Carl was just talking about like, so my clients like don't necessarily bring up, this idea that eyewitness testimony is inaccurate, but they more bring up a general knowledge that like our memories are not always accurate in general. Like we misremember, like Carl was saying, we sort of add information onto things as stories progress. The more like, we pull out a memory and the more it's susceptible to distortion. And so I guess when clients are saying like, well, how can I know if I can trust my memory when our memories are known to be, not accurate? Then I feel like what exactly like do you do with that? Like they'll, if someone's like doubting, how do I know that like I didn't, actually assault that person? Like I don't quite remember clearly what happened that day. Like, yeah, like where would you go with that, I guess?
That's really that's an abstract fact. Memories can be fallible, right? We could also say germs exist, and that abstract fact can then be recruited into contamination fears, or parents hurt their children, so that's an abstract fact, right? The question again comes back to how does that become relevant in the here and now to this to what's happening right now.
Yeah, well, I guess the like bridge would be like in someone's logic. If, you know, I think that I'm misremembering this, or if I can't remember clearly and I know memories aren't accurate, and like, how do I know that, you know, this didn't happen? Or how do I know I'm remembering clearly if I, don't remember all the details or what have you?
Notice that they. Oh, go ahead, Angie.
I was just going to say quickly, sometimes it's about looking at evidence that's actually not there too. Like if OCD says maybe I killed my neighbor yesterday, is there any evidence of a weapon? Are there police next door? None of that exists. So you're actually trusting what isn't there sometimes too.
Right. And I guess I know that. I think where the place I get most stuck with clients, or like where I see clients get the most stuck, is with like remote memories. And like, you know, how do I remember, like, how do I, you know, trust that this thing did or didn't happen years ago when my memory
I
has
would point out,
distorted since that point. Yeah.
I would ask, why do they not trust themselves in this area, but they do in this area? Like, I'll always say, well, how do you know you didn't rob a bank? And they'll say, well, I just know I did, you know. Okay, so you're able to trust your memory in this space. Can you see that the only reason you don't in this space has nothing to do with like your memory's ability? It has to do with the story that surrounds it and your feared self.
Okay. That makes more sense. So kind of tying it back to like the relevance.
And
And the cherry picking.
Even if it's one example. Oh, go ahead, Carl.
Yes, it's called the selectivity of doubt. Right. That's the whole nature, is that these stories are idiosyncratic and selective. Right. And you know, Kate just gave a perfect example of that. Right. You don't doubt your memory in any other area, but this area that happens to hook you. All right. Okay. So this isn't a memory problem. This is a doubting problem.
It's a very specific doubt. Even in that experience 8 years ago or whatever it is, it's them thinking, well, maybe I sexually assaulted someone because I don't completely remember the night. But why aren't they then thinking maybe I keyed my neighbor's car or I yelled a homophobic or racial slur? They're not coming up with those things as they're doubting what happened in that normal memory gap. We all have memory gaps. Try to think through this morning and give me exactly a frame by frame play through the first 15 minutes of your day. You cannot do it. You aren't going to hold all that material. Your memory is not supposed to have frame by frame recall. That's how memory works. So when they're doing stuff like that, call out other examples on what are things that you're not worried about these things. Why? That starts to show that selectivity of even that very particular moment in time.
That's well, thank you.
Deborah's got her hand up and she's asking, but memory isn't a sense, right?
Yeah, I want to know why it's being introduced in the way on the same level as all the other reality sensing aspects. Isn't it something else? Isn't it some other category of knowing or not knowing? I feel like it isn't like apprehending something with your eyes or your hands or whatever.
Carl?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And you know, there's a psychologist, there's Italian psychologist who has come up with this idea that fundamentally OCD is a trust disorder. And what do we mistrust? We mistrust our senses. We mistrust our memories. We mistrust our inner sense. We mistrust our common sense. And ultimately, we mistrust ourselves. That's the feared possible self. So there are all of these dimensions, as you point out, where we have mistrust. And what I-CBT offers is the restoration of the trust that you had, as Mike would say, before you started doubting. You had that trust, you lost that trust, and it's possible to restore that trust. And to say that you then have to live in a world of possibility and uncertainty really deprives people of that opportunity to do that. And it happens. We see it happen all the time. For some of it's happened personally. But you're right. You're right. You know, memory is a different mental function than the senses. Absolutely.
Thank you.
So we only have 1 minute left, and a lot of questions left in the chat. So we had put all of our email addresses into the chat. So contact us. Any final words from anybody? Just hearts.
It was a lot of fun. Thanks for hanging out.
Yeah.
I'll just say just a quick word about the enthusiasm in this community is, you know, everyone here who's tried to learn this model and practice with this model. You know, we're not getting paid for this time. Like, we really believe in this for good reason. And the reason I'm here is because of all the great people who came before who helped me understand this. So if you're, you know, in a position where you're wanting to take this on, learn how to do it, join the groups, hang out with us, we'll help you get up to speed.
That was a great conclusion, everybody.
Yeah, we'll see everybody in here.